And you talk to so many people who have long COVID. What were those conversations like?
I'm in bed, I can't move, and I have an IV for my food because I can't chew.
There's also a rise of kind of gurus, we call them in the health world, and that's like a term taken specifically from religion.
And when I say religious in these contexts, what I really mean is deeply held metaphysical beliefs, the glue that keeps our worldview together. There's a lot of caves with a lot of trolls in them telling you that knowledge lives in their particular cave. There was this guy, Horace Fletcher, the great masticator. He would mail envelopes of his shit to people and he would say, look, my shit, literally, my shit doesn't stink.
We're surrounded by ultra-processed food, but also ultra-processed information.
There's an endless churn of studies that come out. Strawberries this, blah, 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 that, whatever. This causes cancer. This cures cancer.
Coffee saves your life one week and the next week it's not, you're gonna die from it. Welcome to 2%. I'm your host, Michael Easter. So Alan Levinovitz, he is not a health journalist, nor is he a doctor. He is a religion scholar at James Madison University. But that background, that has allowed him to figure out something really important. And that's that the way most of us think about health, it often functions like a religion. Think about it. There are ideas of purity and contamination and salvation. And there are also tribes that will turn on you the second that you question the doctrine. Now, once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. So the arguments that we all have and see online about science, diets, seed oils, longevity, raw milk, long COVID, they often aren't disagreements about data. They're often disagreements about who you are. Now, why are we bringing on Alan now? Well, he recently wrote a piece for Wired magazine about long COVID, and the backlash he got, it was immediate and it was vicious. So we're going to start there with that piece, not because we want to relitigate the science, but because the backlash itself, it is one of the cleanest demonstrations of his thesis that I have seen in years. In this interview, well, it can help you think about your own health beliefs much better and in a new light. So let's bring on Alan now. Well, Alan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, so new edition of Wired. You write an article on long COVID, basically about brain retraining approaches, the role of the brain in chronic illness, and why some of these treatments seem to work for some patients, but they're kind of seen as heretical among people who suffer from long COVID and these patient advocacy groups. And the response, it was intense. What has it been like for you, given the response online?
Well, it's been a little scary, to be honest. I've seen, there's some people who have watched every second of every video that's available of me online, clipped it to make me look as bad as possible, read every single post, every single piece of writing. And again, I guess that's just the risk of being out there. And I want to say up front and center, whatever I'm experiencing online, some kind of online pylon, it's nothing like being debilitated by a severe chronic illness and told by your family and friends that you're faking, that it's all in your head, that it's fake, that long COVID isn't real. So I keep that in mind. I get a little scared if there's, I get an email that's CC'd to my department head, or I get people coming up with petitions calling for things to be changed or whatever. But, at the end of the day, this is a group of people who have suffered something far worse than I can imagine.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit. I mean, I sort of touched on the article a little bit, but tell us kind of in your words, what is the article about? And then why was there such a backlash to the article in the first place? Also, let me say that we're focusing on the backlash, but there are a ton of people who have said this is a wonderful article. And I will say from my own perspective as a journalist, I thought it was exceedingly well reported and generally fair and doing the job of journalism to raise big questions that I think are trying to be helpful.
Yeah, so it's tough to summarize the article. I mean, it is about long COVID, basically. What's the state of the science on long COVID and what explains that? And in order to tell that story, I had to get into the world of what's called myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, which goes back many decades. But long story short is this. No one really knows what causes long COVID other than sort of by definition, it's triggered by a COVID infection. And no one knows why some people's symptoms last longer. There are biomarkers that have been proposed to show that the symptoms are real, which they are, of course. But we don't know whether those symptoms are caused by chronic stress, by infection, by deconditioning, by some combination of all of those. And the problem is that all of those things that I've said, stress, deconditioning, some other kind of infection, these are arguments that people in this world have heard many, many times. And they've heard these arguments in the in the context of people trying to dismiss their illness. So to tell them that, in fact, they are manufacturing these symptoms through having wrong beliefs. And if only they could resolve what is purely a psychiatric condition, which they're choosing not to do or something like that, then they would be healed. And often those accusations even extend so far as to say that they're malingering or faking. So millions of people who are extremely sick have been told this. And what I was trying to explore in the Wired piece was how that patient advocacy community has become extremely powerful and, in my opinion, captured largely the journalistic and scientific establishment when it comes to reporting on and researching this condition. And it's more true in the United States. There's a little bit less of that capture in Europe, but overall, I think it's a pretty safe statement. And what that boils down to is this. There is an insistence that anything that involves the brain or nervous system needs to be kind of bracketed unless it's attached to a biological explanation. And the reason for that is that biology is seen as legitimizing, whereas psychology or the brain or mind is seen as delegitimizing or gaslighting or blaming the patient.
Yeah, it kind of becomes this, oh, it's all in your head.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what I try to point out in the article is that there's pretty good evidence, or at least some promising evidence, that some people's recoveries have to do with their ability to calm their nervous system. And that nervous system dysregulation seems like, at least in some people, to be a promising avenue for healing. And also that the absence of any clear biomarkers after over $2 billion and 5 years of research into this condition tells us it's likely that the dysfunction is happening somewhere that's difficult to study. Hardest part of the human to study is the brain and the nervous system. So I think there's certainly a lot of evidence that points to this area as promising research, but as the backlash illustrates, it's very difficult to talk about it without falling back into a kind of, it's all in your head, it's wrong beliefs, this is psychogenic, it's psychosomatic, it's your fault, you're malingering sort of narrative.
Yeah. So your background, you're not a doctor, you do some health journalism or health anthropology, I don't know what you want to call it, but your main training is that you are a religion scholar. Right? And so a lot of your work looks at how the way people talk about health has some of the same patterns and structures as religion. How did you see that play out in the backlash you've received?
So throughout my whole career, which goes back more than a decade, what I've really been interested in is how, you say religion, but my area of background is classical Chinese thought. I happen to, you can only study classical Chinese thought in religion departments, typically with some exceptions, Michigan and Hawaii. But so what I'm really interested in is how metaphysics, I guess you could say, shapes our reality, shapes our perception of reality, shapes our beliefs about ourselves, and especially health and science. And so in this context, what I saw so clearly was that a kind of metaphysics, it was making it hard for people to talk about these issues. So words like real get thrown around all the time. Many of the accusations that you'll see about my piece, which if you read the piece, of course, it's like a lot of people I talk to like, wait, I don't think they're reading the piece. But people say he's saying long COVID's not real. And this is very interesting. It's sort of like when people say this food isn't real. You need to eat real food. So a lot of what I'm seeing coming out of this world of philosophy and religion and metaphysics is that behind what look like scientific arguments and really impassioned defenses of, in this case, a sort of etiology of long COVID, but in my other work, dietary interventions or certain kinds of medical treatments, what's operative in the background is a metaphysics that people feel very strongly about and need to be able to defend using whatever the most powerful rhetoric is of the day, which right now is science and quantifiable research.
Yeah. So in your book, Natural, that came out in 2020. Walk us through that. What prompted that and kind of what is the argument of the book?
Really simply, as I was working on dietary stuff for the book before that, looking at non-celiac gluten sensitivity, just looking at people's dietary patterns in general, also looking at pseudoscience. So I would run into people trying to heal their cancer with dietary interventions and that sort of thing, and then dying if they also abandoned chemo and surgery. What I saw was the word natural came up all the time. People would say, what you should do is eat naturally. And that was used, though, always to defend whatever it was that they wanted to eat. So vegetarians would often say, that's the natural diet of humans. And this goes back historically for centuries. And I started to realize that what natural was was a stand-in, a kind of scientific sounding or secular, non-religious stand-in for holy or pure. And what nature was a scientific or secular stand-in for an all-powerful organizing force that's on our side. And if we align with nature, then we will be healthy and happy. And if we don't align with nature, then that explains all of our suffering. And so what I do in Natural is I show how that plays out in so many contexts, not just health, but in economic theories. We should use natural markets, for example, this idea that somehow there's a force that organizes everything harmoniously if only we didn't interfere with it.
Yeah. Where else did you see it? So I think you see it a lot in diet. I mean, I think like clean eating, that's clearly there's some implication of natural. Where else have you seen it in the health realm?
Oh my gosh. Where does it not crop up? So childbirth is a really good example. And actually, let me zoom in on childbirth, because I think I went into this really cynical about naturalness. Of why are people so into natural? Yeah. But when I interviewed many, many mothers who had opted for natural childbirth, they would start by giving scientific reasons. So they'd talk about, dangers in hospitals or bonding with the child or whatever, you name it. And they would cite studies because that's the currency of truth right now. But when I continued to talk with them, they would say things like, well, also I wanted to be at home. I wanted to feel in control of my birth. I didn't want to give birth in some sort of hospital where it feels like there's nothing special or holy about this ritual of giving birth. And I was like, wow, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. The problem is that in order to justify choices like I wanted to do something that feels beautiful or feels sacred to me, because those sorts of values aren't allowed in the kind of public square, people kept having to shift naturalness into a kind of scientific argument. So I think part of the problem actually is that people want to do things because it makes them feel freer, or it makes them feel more empowered, or they think it's beautiful. And because that kind of argument is sort of disallowed or is weaker than scientific arguments, they end up shifting to, well, look at this study that says natural births are better, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I also see it in sports too, right? So naturalness is a really important part of sports. So I talk about that a lot. And that actually makes a lot of sense. We want our athletes to be natural. Why? Because otherwise people would be winning the sprint using a motorcycle. I mean, it's like, so sports itself is actually built around a kind of messy but important conception of naturalness.
Yeah.
Those are two examples.
What are some examples in the diet world? I feel like those are the things that people probably will see the most often.
Carnivore diet. People will often say that what humans should naturally eat, the natural ideal diet, is all meat. And they'll point to how indigenous Alaskans or something would, when given the choice, opt always for organ meat or marrow or something like that. Or they will talk about how the low carb diet is a natural diet. And then what people do when they make these arguments is actually very religious. They say back in the day, when people hadn't been corrupted by modernity, here's what they ate. So they use semi-nomadic or nomadic hunter-gatherers as the stand-in for Eden. And then they take their diet, whether it's the carnivore diet or the vegetarian diet or whatever it is, they backfit it. In general, this is the same true for organic food. So organic is just sort of, kissing cousins with natural. And they say, well, back in the day when people didn't get sick, there weren't any inorganic foods or there weren't GMOs or whatever. So GMOs, another really good example of that. And interestingly, again, to focus a bit, I know it's a long answer on GMOs in the diet world. I think part of what's going on is also religious, which is that genetic engineering is seen as playing God. And what I actually don't get to talk about in the book, but which is really important, is the same kind of resistance to nuclear energy happens as well. So in the naturalness world, there's this idea that if we're splitting atoms or engineering genetics, we're playing God, and that's necessarily wrong and therefore extremely dangerous. And so you get real problems with the actual ability to assess, which foods are actually dangerous for us. There are obviously processed foods that are extremely bad for our health for a variety of reasons. There are forms of energy that are really bad. But once you have that kind of religious/metaphysical framework in the background, it can be very difficult to actually talk about what's driving people's arguments.
Yeah. What other elements of, I'll use the term religious, do you see in the health world? As you were talking, I was thinking even like there's also a rise of kind of gurus, we call them in the health world. And that's like a term taken specifically from religion.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny looking at the history of this. I spent a lot of time looking at the history, especially of dietary things, but now also health trends in general. People, you would be shocked, or people who aren't familiar with this history. There was this guy, Horace Fletcher. He was popular in the early to mid 20th century, the great masticator. So his theory was that you were supposed to chew food, I forget exactly, 100 times, 200 times before you swallowed it. And he would mail envelopes of his shit to people, and he would say, look, my shit doesn't stink. That's what he would say. Because I chew my food like this. Can you imagine this? He would go to colleges, he would do strength competitions with people. He'd be like, they're famous. He bested Yale athletes in a strength competition. He was this older guy. The same kind of things you see today, right? This is the RFK Jr. sort of approach. Do a bunch of shirtless pushups with Kid Rock to prove that whatever your preferred health, intervention is the right one. And people loved it. People loved the great masticator. Everyone was chewing their food 100 times. All these celebrities, Rockefeller, authors, Henry James, I think. I forget exactly who, but you see the same thing again and again and again. And to tie this back a little bit to the Wired piece, understandably, a lot of people in this world see the sorts of people that I highlighted, the brain retraining clinicians, as just another set of snake oil gurus. And to be fair, some of them are, and they have that kind of charisma. They have that sort of everyone will heal themselves if they follow me. And that stuff's bad. It's bad, and it makes it difficult to see things clearly.
Given that, how do you think about balancing? So there's these two tensions. On one hand, we want to look at the broad base of evidence, what works for most people most of the time. At the same time, I do think these sort of N of one, my own personal experience, can be useful. And in the case of kind of what you wrote about with the long COVID piece, it's like there's a lot of different things that may or may not work. This brain training stuff seems to work for at least some population of people who have long COVID. At the same time, to your point, there are snake oil salesmen. And here's this other type of evidence. So how the hell do you how do you wade through that as a human being?
What a big question.
Sorry.
I guess, so one thing I would say about the brain retraining coaching world, whatever you want to call it, is that there are some kinds of interventions, and I didn't get into this a lot in the Wired piece, but I think it's really important. There's some kinds of interventions that are just harder to test in the way that our institutions of scientific inquiry are set up than others. They're just more difficult to test. So for example, Biggest Loser, the television show, as a year-long weight loss intervention is terrific. It works great. Like, everyone who goes on Biggest Loser loses a ton of weight. Like, how do you do a randomized controlled trial of being on the Biggest Loser as a year-long weight loss intervention? You can't. What does the blinding look like? I mean, it wouldn't even make any sense. And so I think a part of what gets lost in these sorts of interventions, at the risk of bringing up something that I know you talk about, I want to stay away from this, but addiction is similar to this. So addiction is a physiological state. You become addicted to alcohol or drugs physiologically. And then it's not magic. It's not that it's not that the addiction is all in your head. It's not that the symptoms of withdrawal are all in your head. That would be absurd to say. But some people kick their addictions through a combination of community and thinking. I mean, it sounds sort of bizarre to put it that way, but that's really what happens. As some people don't. For some people, it doesn't work. Some people have to find the right community for them. Some people try 6 times to kick their addiction until they finally find, at the right time in their life, the community that works right for them. None of that is unscientific or woo-woo. None of that implies that if only addicts changed their minds, they would just heal, even though there are, of course, some cases of people who, after like a car accident with their kid in the back or something, just instantaneously kick their addiction. So I think that's actually, there's no perfect parallel. And when people hear addiction, they often think, well, that's caused by choices you've made as opposed to post-viral infection, which is whatever. That's not really the point in this analogy. The point is there are physiological states, really entrenched ones, that cause physiological symptoms that we know can be resolved through effortful involvement in a community and a set of beliefs that often doesn't work the first time or the second time or the third time, and often will work for one person and be deeply alienating to someone else. Again, I don't want to get into AA or anything like that, but for some people, AA is a nightmare. They hate the God talk. They hate the higher power talk. And, it's messy. How do you navigate that? Well, one thing I think you need to do, and this is something I think in the long COVID world is just a disaster, is when you have something dominated by biomedical science, this happens in nutrition science too, there's an endless churn of studies that come out. Strawberries this, blah, 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 that, whatever, right? I mean, there's just endless nutrition. This causes cancer. This cures cancer.
Coffee saves your life one week, and the next week it's nope, you're going to die from it.
Totally. What people don't realize, because long COVID and viral research sounds more official or something than nutrition research, but in a world where everyone, remember, Michael, the pandemic, 2020, I know this from speaking with tons of scientists, all these labs shut down. The only people that were coming in were COVID patients. So what do you do if you're a lab that was studying one thing, but it's 2020? You're like, well, I guess we've got these patients coming in. We got some samples in the fridge. I don't know. Let's turn to COVID. Let's study COVID. Let's study long COVID. So what you had was a ton of people churning out COVID and long COVID studies, and a public desperate for answers. And so, for example, I'm just going to take one example. There was a 2026 study in Cell that came out from a sort of prominent long COVID immunologist named Akiko Iwasaki. She's at Yale. And people were tweeting this at me and sending it to me. And they're like, oh, you say long COVID is fake. You say we don't know the mechanism. What about this study? So I'm looking at the study, and what Iwasaki's done is an interesting study. They took antibodies that are statistically significantly more elevated in people with long COVID, although it's not clear exactly how much, and certainly nothing like you would see in like an MS cohort. Mm-hmm. But these antibodies are slightly elevated. And they injected them into mice, and they seemed to see similar symptoms in the mice as to what you see in long COVID. And another group replicated it. Okay. For people who really want to prove that COVID is real, and by real they mean the symptoms are caused entirely by elevated autoantibodies, which in turn are caused entirely by the COVID infection. This study looked like proof. But for any professional immunologist, this study looks like exactly what it is: a very preliminary hypothesis generating study that has some promise, but there's all sorts of confounders, all sorts of variables that weren't controlled for. It doesn't matter to people. That's the same as these studies about strawberries, right? They're good. They're important in certain ways. We need to be doing research on all kinds of stuff, but they don't prove anything. And yet every time a study comes out, you know how it is. You drop the abstract in, you drop the link in, you're like, peace, science, I just proved it. Science, the science is one. It's like those signs. Science is real. And I actually don't think Iwasaki would ever say anything like what the people who are citing her studies are saying. Yeah. And that's part of the problem too, but she's not going to wade in and say, stop saying that. My study is just barely a hypothesis generator, because scientists are people. And this community sees her as a savior. And she too is subject to death threats in the same way that the other researchers I've talked about are. And so she's just kind of going to stay out of it. And she's going to do her science, which is great. She keep doing science. But I don't think she's willing or able to intervene and stop the kind of disingenuous or deceptive framing of or exaggeration of what it is that her studies do or don't show or prove.
Why do you think people get so vehement around their beliefs, whether it's the stuff that you've experienced with the long COVID patient advocacy groups, or whether it's if I go online and I look up carnivore diet on Twitter and I see people just tearing each other's heads off, doing the thing with the abstracts, and it just so embedded.
Well, with health and with diet, which is bound up with health, stuff's scary. We die. We suffer. With food, it's the only time really, other than breathing, that we take something from, and vaccines, which to the point that you're sort of asking about, where we take something from outside of our body and put it inside of ourselves. It's a very personal thing. It's no surprise that every single religion and cultural tradition has taboos around food, has food rituals. And so these are deeply personal features of our life. They're scary. They're vulnerable. We are vulnerable when we eat. We are vulnerable when we go to the doctor. And especially if someone is sick and they've been accused of faking, or if they're sick and they've been told it's all in their head, or if they've been sick and they're experiencing extremely intense physiological symptoms and someone tells them that it's just their anxiety, but they know that this is nothing like their anxiety or whatever it happens to be. And then, of course, there's the flip side. And I know you're also familiar with this, Michael, but when people resolve something, so if someone's been struggling with their weight for years and then they go on the keto diet and start doing CrossFit and all of a sudden they feel better than they ever have in their entire life and health conditions disappear and it feels almost miraculously effortless, they're like, holy crap, this is incredible. I'm going to evangelize this. And this goes for the people who are doing the mind-body stuff with long COVID as well. They feel like that too. So there's just because someone's evangelizing some sort of intervention doesn't mean it worked or didn't work or anything like that. I would say one thing though, and this is why I was drawn to the mind-body stuff in long COVID. With dietary interventions or with pharmaceutical interventions, some people with long COVID claim they have great success with low-dose naltrexone or metformin, things that have not been proven either. Yeah. But when you say the low-dose naltrexone helped me, what you're saying is this pharmacological intervention helped me. So if so in some of these studies of metformin or rituximab, I pronounced it wrong. It doesn't matter. Some of the studies of pharmacological interventions for long COVID, 30 to 60% of the placebo arm also recover. So the study is negative because the active arm is no better than the placebo arm. But in one of them, there was even sustained recovery for a year in the placebo arm. If you're testing a pharmaceutical, that's a failure. If you're testing a mind-body trial, or a mind-body intervention, it is a failure for the specific intervention. But it also tells you that people are recovering either spontaneously or because they're in the trial or because the treatment as usual arm of the trial was affected. And so in many ways, that's a positive result. Yeah, if you're not looking to confirm a pharmaceutical, if all you're looking to do is see, hey, how can we get people's symptoms to remit, or how can we get people to recover partially or fully from this condition? A study in which the placebo arm is remarkably successful tells you something. It doesn't tell you that the pharmaceutical worked, but it tells you that something works, right? So in a way, it's all, and so that's something I would point out as well. That's a little bit different from, and which gets confused when people are like, we don't have any evidence of these interventions working. So, well. And then they get mad about the placebo effect and they talk about, which I understand too. People can exaggerate that. Often placebo is confused with, regression to the mean. You come in when you're really sick, so you're likely to heal just over the course of time. But again, if you can attribute all of these recoveries to natural remission, we should be telling people who get long COVID, hey, don't worry. Most people naturally remit. That should be the first thing clinicians say, but they don't. They say other stuff, scary stuff, like this is a chronic condition that for most people is with them for the rest of their lives.
Why do you think there's such a tension between these two ideas of body and mind? We see them as like these separate, distinct things where they're not necessary. They're not always that, right? Like one affects the other.
Because as embodied human beings, we feel our minds, and we feel our minds as distinct from our bodies. And sometimes we can change our minds. It's another version of the free will question. Yeah. So body mind is just is a different version of one of the most intractable questions in philosophy, and it comes up in all cultures. You have the soul in lots of cultures. You have the idea of a person persisting in the afterlife or being reincarnated. I can't think honestly. I mean, maybe there's some, but the vast majority of cultures that I've studied have some version of a ghost in the machine. And they also have explanations of causality that are neither physical nor mental. This goes to the book I'm currently working on. They call them supernatural. And again, I've seen people sort of clipping interviews I have and being like, he thinks it's just demons, but it's not actually what I'm saying at all. But what we do have in a lot of cultures is people saying, okay, this is not caused by a broken limb. This pain you're having, it's not a broken limb. It's also not you faking. Mm-hmm. So what is it? They're like, what is it? In all cultures have tried to figure out what could be this thing that is not your choice, that is not biological or physiological, and they come up with all kinds of kooky answers. It's an angry deceased ancestor. It's a demon. And we're trying to do that today because the words for the intersection between mind and body, that dash or that hyphen, that's a really mysterious place. but it exists. It's a real place. As you said, our body, the mind is the brain. Whenever I interview neurologists, they're always doing scare quotes the whole time. They're like, whoa, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, why are you doing the scare quotes? They're like, well, how do you even talk about any of this stuff?
Yeah. To get back to the idea of natural. So when someone, say, goes to the grocery store and there's, the natural peanut butter versus the one that doesn't say natural on it, or I don't know, maybe they're drawn to raw milk or something. Do you think that the part of the draw is that we have modernized so much that maybe we feel removed from something in a way?
100%.
Something sacred almost.
Something sacred. Absolutely. So over one of my friends in history of technology calls this epistemic opacity, which I think is a really interesting phrase. It's a fancy phrase, but what he basically means is more and more of what's around us is impossible for us to understand. So, or even feel like we understand. So this could be like, I have no idea what's happening in this computer. I have no idea how to fix my computer. I have no idea how any of this technology works. I don't know how my microwave works. Even cars. You used to be able to fix a car if you were pretty good with cars in the 1950s or 60s. You just open an engine. Every engine was like basically the same. Now you got to plug it into a computer. Everything's very distant. We don't know where our food comes from. It's the same reason people like farmers markets. And so that's deeply disempowering. It makes us feel like we depend on experts and authorities that are beyond our control. We just have to kind of take what we get. We can't fix it ourselves. So yes, I absolutely think a part of the appeal of natural, and this is a part of it that I actually really empathize with, is just people being like, hey man, I don't like living in a world where I don't know where stuff comes from and I don't understand how it was made. That makes me feel weird. It makes me feel bad. It makes me feel powerless. And I reject that. And I'm going to do whatever I can to not feel that way. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, part of what I love about your work and writing is that you're kind of honest about where your mind changes and situations you've been in where you've seen some of these same things in yourself. Tell us the anecdote when you went to Peru to a hunter-gatherer tribe who had just gotten solar lighting.
That was so funny. I went to Peru to meet with some Machigenga. So if you want to meet with like truly nomadic hunter-gatherers, it takes many, 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 many months. But the Machigenga in Peru are people who are semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who you can meet with if you have the right contacts. So I went to meet with them and I wanted to see what it was like to live as natural a lifestyle as people could be living. And I went into the people there speak sort of some of the people in the village speak Spanish. So I was communicating in broken Spanish.
Yeah.
And there was this one guy who I happened to be talking with, and I had seen that they had just gotten solar lighting for sort of the central area of their village, solar powered light. And I think about light pollution, and I like being able to see the stars. When I go camping, I'm like, oh, it's so great. We're finally away from the lights. It sucks when I can't see the stars. I'm in a big city. And so I thought to myself, even though I'm writing this book about natural bias, I think to myself, oh God, it must suck. Like I can't see the stars anymore. And I asked him, what's it like to have this light now in your village? And he looks at me like I'm nuts. And he was like, it's great. It's really good. I was like, why? Like, what is it? What, like, it was so absurd in retro. I was like, why? What's good about it? He looks at me, he's like, we can see at night now. Like I was a child. I was like, oh, yes. Of course, that would be very advantageous. So again, a lot of what we're feeling now, to your point, which I think is really important earlier, a lot of what we feel about naturalness is the product of a specific cultural moment and a kind of alienation from the stuff around us. But obviously for this guy, like, dude just wants to see at night. So he doesn't stub his toe. It's great. There's lights. It's awesome.
Right.
He's in a very different place.
And there's a good reason we have these advancements, because in the past we were stubbing our toes at night and going, well, maybe we should get some lights around here. And then, fast forward 100 years, now we're going, there's too many damn lights in here. We need to kill the lights.
Yeah. And like you talked about the peanut butter. I mean, another reason you might opt for natural peanut butter is there isn't as much sugar in it. Mm-hmm. So you feel sated more quickly, or it doesn't cause you to consume as many calories. To me, that's really reasonable. Yeah. And so it's hard to separate out the kind of natural, unnatural binary from actually really reasonable claims like we now have extremely palatable, extremely cheap calories everywhere, thanks to highly technological food processing. And that technology, which is very unnatural, has been used to exploit our appetites in a way that is profoundly unhealthy for many, many people. So that can be true, while it is also true that natural and unnatural are not kind of cosmic indicators of what's better or worse for us as human beings.
And that takes work, right? It's almost like you need to, as a person, you need to strip away the nuance and go, okay, where is this just sort of a almost religious argument? But where does this thing have actual benefits that I could almost measure in a way? And that's actually hard. It takes more effort. Whereas if you just put natural on it, it becomes, I can just offload my decision-making to this word.
Absolutely. It's a cognitive labor-saving device. And we do that all the time with all kinds of things. We believe all kinds of stuff just because it would be too much effort to check it ourselves, which is honestly, Michael, it's as it should be. There's a brilliant historian of science named Stephen Shapin, who has, I think, a PhD in genetics or something like that. And he's talking about how he understands climate science. And he says, what it is to understand climate science is not to actually understand climate science, to go and do all of the research, to look at everything yourself. That's what climate scientists do. What he says is to understand climate science is to know where knowledge lives. I love that phrase. So it's a matter of knowing which institutions to trust and a matter of knowing how much emphasis to place on any given conclusion that someone is saying. And which brings me to another thing, which goes to the Wired piece and goes to the health stuff. We are just flooded by information. We've got a million different gurus who, like processed food, have been themselves hyper-processed to convince us that they're right. They've got bodies that would shame Sean Connery in his prime or Marlon Brando in their prime. You know, like they look absurd. They're carefully cultivated to convince us of things. They tell us that the government is hiding things from us, that scientists are corrupt. And all of these things are true narrowly, but not necessarily broadly. And so it creates an environment in which, as you know, trust in science and medicine and the government is way down. And people are cast into a world where virtually anyone could be trusted. And if you're vulnerable and if you're seeking answers, if you've been burned by a doctor or you specifically have been harmed by science that turned out to be inaccurate, you're going to be ready and willing to believe you're going to be ready and willing to use Shapin's phrase to think that knowledge lives elsewhere. And that's really dangerous because there's a lot of caves with a lot of trolls in them telling you that knowledge lives in their particular cave.
Yeah. One thing, you kind of talked about the processing of information, and it's almost like we're surrounded by ultra-processed food, but also ultra-processed information. And I feel like that very much happened in a lot of cases with your Wired piece, in the sense that, you know, the piece is behind a paywall. It's 7,500 words. How many sources did you talk to?
Oh my God. I mean, I don't even know how many are in the piece itself. 7,500 words. I talked to a lot of different people in the piece. Probably I cite at least 20 or 30 people. I don't know. I've talked to, researching it, at least 300 sources between patients, scientists, crazy.
Yeah. And then on Twitter, it's like one thing gets pulled out of context. And then here's why this is wrong, pile on. And you could just tell once I saw sort of what was happening on the Twitter feed, I said, okay. And then I sat down and read 7,500 words. I go, most of what is out there that is so toxic is completely out of scope of the art, or the article covers it in some nuanced way, but that just didn't get pulled up.
Yeah, I had a friend who had said he'd read the comments first, because you have to subscribe to the article. So he read the comments first on the article and online, and then he subscribed and read the article. And he was like, it was the strangest experience to him, because each paragraph he was like, wait, isn't this one of the things they said he didn't address or whatever? And you're right, with ultra-processed information, I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe a couple of years back about exactly that, about ultra-processed information. So in the same way that our appetite for food has been hijacked by a system designed to exploit it, our appetite for information has been hijacked by a system designed to exploit it. So quick sound bites, really palatable, polarizing, telling you that this is salvation if you believe this, but this guy is actually trying to kill you if you believe that. One of the things I found really interesting about people reading the article is that they were determined to make it an article about how brain retraining works. And it's just not about that. Right. I don't know what's going on with this brain retraining stuff. Personally, I believe, having talked to, a dozen severely ill patients, I believe that at least in some subset of patients, how big, I don't know, these approaches are effective. I don't think they are all just placebo in the sense of any approach or belief in the approach or natural remission.
Yeah.
That's what I believe. But the article is not about that. The article is about how we need to figure that out and the kinds of broader sociocultural forces at play, whether it's how studies are designed, whether it's this idea of real and fake disease, whether it's the capture of journalistic the journalists that are reporting on this and the scientists that are researching it, all of that makes it just very, very difficult to figure out what's going on. But that doesn't fit into ultra-processed information. Even what I just said just then is like too much. We need sentence. Alan Levinovitz believes long COVID is fake, right? Yeah, and again, I get it, but it's not a good environment. It's really unhealthy.
Yeah. And it seems like even the researchers, people working on this, people who are seriously credentialed, kind of dedicating their lives to this, have even faced pushback because it immediately gets boiled down to this person's trying to disprove that long COVID has a biological element or something like that.
Absolutely. And also, and again, not to keep leaning on Chapman, obviously, Stephen Chapman, I just think this guy's brilliant. He has a book, I forget what the subtitle is exactly. The title's Never Pure, and the subtitle is something like A History of Science as if it were conducted by real people living real lives with the desire to actually become famous and make lots of money, or something like that. I forget. But basically, he's like, hey, look, man, scientists are real people. So imagine, again, it's the long COVID world. You have an extremely loud, really traumatized, severely ill population looking for scientists who are going to be their saviors. You put out your study on immunology. It's very preliminary. They're like, oh my God, this is finally it. This is the key. You feel really good about yourself. There are financial incentives. I mean, people talk about like financial incentives built into the mind-body alternative guru stuff. But of course, there's financial incentives built into science. These people are getting giant multi-million-dollar grants to study things. They are getting contracts with companies to produce potentially tests for long COVID. So they too are incentivized to believe that their science proves more than it does and is more promising than it is. We know that. These are just normal science. They're regular human beings like anyone else. And so I think it's also really important for us to understand that the scientific community does not exist in a bubble. It too is influenced by sociocultural forces. And, you know, that's important to see with something like long COVID. It's just very difficult to communicate that when we're in a world awash with ultra-processed information.
Do you feel like one of the underlying things that leads something to take on a religious bent is the possibility of harm and also fear? Because, for example, I don't see people arguing, to the death about what sock is best or what, t-shirt, is it better to have a cotton t-shirt or polyester? But you do see it in diet, where someone can pull, okay, well, this study found X association with cancer, or long COVID obviously has, serious health implications. How does fear play into all this? And also danger?
Yeah, both really important. So first I want to say, when people say this is religious, I actually, I want to sort of just bracket something and say, I think that when people say religious, and when I say religious in these contexts, what I really mean is deeply held metaphysical beliefs, the glue that keeps our worldview together. So that doesn't have to be religious in a traditional sense. Free will in this sense is a kind of supernatural entity that is religious in the way I'm talking about. So really, when I say religion, what I'm trying to call people's attention to is that what we see in traditional religions is also present in everyone's lives. We have invisible metaphysical assumptions that govern how we perceive the world and how we make moral judgments. So that's the first thing I say. So now back to the fear and danger thing. Yes.
Yes. Good.
Yes.
Quick answer.
That's right. So I think that the more something seems like it threatens either our identity, sort of spiritually or whatever you want to call it, as like how we perceive ourselves as a person or a moral being, and also physically, how we perceive our safety. Whenever something threatens those things, we activate a kind of fight or flight response, actually, right? We get really threatened. We get really angry. That's why when someone insults your family or your kids, you get really, really upset. And I get that. It makes sense. Humans should when they are threatened in a way that could kill them or in a way that threatens their deeply held beliefs, they're going to respond that way. But of course, it makes it hard to think clearly. I mean, I'll give you one example, Michael. I write about this in the Wired piece.
Yeah.
A lot of people with long COVID, if their kids get long COVID, Child Protective Services will sometimes try to take their kids away.
Why is that?
It's hard to imagine what it would be like to be a person who's severely sick, whose kid is severely sick, and then the government comes and tries to take your kid away. I would be sending angry emails to me all the time. And if I saw my article, how could I possibly read that in some kind of objective, dispassionate way? I would be impossible. And of course, when I say this, the people who are in that situation are going to be like, he's saying we're not objective because we've gone through this thing. That's just a way to gaslight us. So that's a way to trap us. And I understand that. And I understand that they have to come from that perspective. They are coming from that perspective. But it remains the case that if you've been horrifically traumatized by something, or if admitting in some kind of alternative worldview is happening in the context of having someone try to take your kids away and accusing you of harming your children.
Because the government think it might be Munchausen's, right?
They do.
Yeah.
So the government thinks it might be parents deliberately harming their kids.
Okay.
Now, I will say that, like, it is entirely possible, I'm not talking about long COVID now, but it is entirely possible for parents to well-meaningly harm their children through health interventions.
Mm-hmm.
You could be a parent that makes your kid neurotic about food, for example. I see this all the time, right? Yeah. You are eating in a way that's super clean and super healthy, and your kid starts to become sort of obsessed with eating super clean or super healthy. So the idea that parents' beliefs and practices around health and diet can't affect their kids is also ridiculous. But it's absolutely false, I believe, that in any of these chronic illness cases, parents are deliberately making their children ill for attention or to keep their kids around the house. I mean, it's just like a monstrous accusation to make. And I can't even imagine how I would feel if someone said that to me. I would lose my mind.
And you talk to so many people who have long COVID. What were those conversations like? Like, what sort of stories did you hear? I was shocked. I did not realize how debilitating it can be. I thought it just meant, oh, your nose is stuffy this was just something that was not on my radar, luckily, because I haven't had to go through that or known anyone who has, but I was shocked at just how debilitating it is. Yeah, well, so it's worth pointing out, there's a huge spectrum of what is even defined as long COVID. And I talk about this in the piece as well, because we have no biomarkers for it. That is to say, biomarkers that are unique to this condition. So it can range from, I believe that this ongoing slight lack of taste that I have, or I believe that this ongoing slightly elevated level of fatigue that I have is due to my COVID infection. That is one version of long COVID. All the way over to, I'm in bed, I can't move. I'm in the dark because I cannot tolerate light, and I have headphones on because I cannot tolerate sound, and I have an IV for my food because I can't chew without experiencing immense crushing pain. So yeah, I talked to a dozen people who are in that situation. It's terrifying. This exists. That same situation exists for other what are called post-acute infectious syndromes. So this has been documented. Again, I talk about this in the Wired piece. So yeah, I think it's really important for people to realize that there are some people who are just incredibly sick. I mean, one of the main people I showcase in the piece was anonymized because he was afraid of having his insurance taken away from him. Another thing that long COVID patients face. Larson was so sick that even while he was talking to me, he was recovering. So before he couldn't talk at all, but he could only talk for maybe like 45 minutes at a time. It got better and better actually as we were going, but he's still very, very sick. Yeah, it's horrible. I hope to raise awareness of that. And while people in the long COVID community already know this, I also take comfort that hearing from someone like you, hey, whoa, I didn't realize how sick people could get from these conditions. Then I've done something right in the article as well, raising awareness of just how debilitating these conditions can be for some people. Yeah, and I think, and you pointed this out in the article, there's a lot of people who say it's just completely made up. It's like, okay, try telling that to someone who's in bed in the dark with headphones on. Like that's clear. That's clearly not right.
It's so obviously not made up. And the other thing, again, I cannot keep emphasizing this enough. It is not the product of false beliefs.
Yeah.
I don't know which analogies to use because they are all imperfect. But here again, I think the addiction analogy can be helpful. You're not addicted to whatever the substance is that you're addicted to because you believe you need it. Like, it's just like a ridiculous position to take. And so in that sense, what these people are experiencing, the symptoms they're experiencing, they are physiological, they are debilitating, and you can't just change your mind about it. So I think a lot of people believe that if only these people could just think differently, they would magically be healed because it is a belief state that is creating their symptoms. That could not be further from the truth. What the brain retraining people say, and I hate that term because it sounds very woo-woo and it's kind of bullshitty, but what these folks say is actually much more like what an addiction specialist might say, which is you have a physiological state that is going to take a long time to recover from. Right now, we don't have a lot of good interventions for it, but we've seen a lot of success with slow, steady progress in communities that share stories that are positive and help people stick to certain plans. And sometimes people relapse, and sometimes these plans don't work. And no one is saying that you are choosing to experience these symptoms. But why not give it a shot?
Yeah.
That I think is a lot more like what's happening here. The only difference, and again, I don't have to talk to you about this, obviously, but the only people would say, well, that there's a big difference. These post-acute infection syndromes aren't caused by choices I made in the past. And it's like, whatever, man. Are you blaming people, addicts for their state? And you're saying you're different from them fundamentally because you didn't choose to get infected by a virus? But that's also cruel. And that's also misguided. So I would push back hard on that objection to the analogy I'm making here. Either way, the broader physiological point remains. And I just think it's really important that people see that. These are people who are super sick. They're desperate. There's no good intervention to help them. What do we do?
Yeah. You mentioned a word earlier, identity. I thought that was interesting. I was talking to my producer here, Robbie Heiser, and he pointed out that when people adopt sort of and buy into one health practice, let's say it's raw milk, it tends to not just be that. There becomes like, well, if raw milk, also then anti-vax, also then XYZ. Why do you think that is? Is that because, why do you think that is? That's the question.
So here's why. There's another, I hate getting into the weeds with philosophy stuff, but there's this philosopher named Quine, W.V. Quine. I don't know, they all had like initials for their first names for a while. C.S. Lewis, G.K. whatever.
Gotcha.
So W.V. Quine. And he had this idea of what he called the web of belief. And what he said is basically, we don't have just a bunch of different beliefs that are independent of each other. We have a web of beliefs that all hang together. And let's take raw milk as an example. So if you end up believing that raw milk is some kind of life-saving nutritional thing, and that this has been hidden from you by the dietary establishment, that's not a belief that's independent of other beliefs. Instead, it's a part of a web of beliefs. In order to believe that, you have to now distrust the medical establishment more generally. And you have to distrust the government more generally. Those kinds of beliefs are at the center of the web. And as soon as those more central beliefs start changing, they open the rest of the web up to other changes. So it's a kind of feedback loop where once you've bought into one belief that entails suspicion of sort of traditional institutions of knowledge making or something like that, well, now the whole web is vulnerable. Now people can move in and say, in the same way that people deceived you about raw milk, they deceived you about vaccines. And in the same way that they deceived you about vaccines, they deceived you about insert whatever. So that's why I think there's these cascade effects, is that the web of belief itself gets shaken. An external belief changes, and that reverberates all the way back to the center of the web.
Yeah, and I would point out that I use the example of, raw milk and anti-vax, but that also works just for someone who's, say, quote unquote, very evidence-based, where if there's not a XYZ study proving this, then no one benefited from it. You're just full of shit. You're making it up.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep, that's absolutely right.
So I just had Melissa Urban on the podcast. She founded the Whole30 diet. And initially, this diet said no seed oils. That was their thinking when they started it. And then she had a team of researchers really look at the evidence, and they reversed their position on that. They said, you know what? We were wrong. Seed oils are fine. We don't think they're a big deal anymore. Go ahead. What do you think it takes for people to reverse their own ideas in the space?
The thing I found that is most powerful, this is going to be, it has nothing to do with research at all, which is kind of interesting, is betrayal. So in these spaces I've found, so if someone's really into holistic medicine, for example, and they work for a clinic that claims to cure cancer with wheatgrass shots, no amount of research is going to disconfirm that person's beliefs, especially if their job and their identity is bound up in it. But if someone in that clinic betrays them, if they discover that someone was lying to them, if they discover that someone was cheating on their taxes even, I mean, something like that, that, in my experience, is the most effective way to start the chain reaction of changing your mind. Because at the end of the day, the person is not, their beliefs are not just about whether they make sense or what the evidence is. It's about something much bigger. So that's the first thing I would say. If, though, you're trying to convince someone of something, or you're wondering, I mean, it depends at what level of a culture and who the person is. So individuals, gosh, like what would change their mind? I mean, for example, a woman I feature in my Wired piece, Georgia Lupi, she had heard about these techniques for helping people recover from long COVID, but she'd always heard about them from people who seemed to have a financial interest or a professional interest in promoting them. Eventually, a friend of hers reached out. I want to get this exactly right. I believe it was a friend of hers, someone she knew on Instagram, who she'd known for a long time and had absolutely no connection to these people. That was really helpful to her. She was like, oh, wait, okay, so this is a friend of mine. This isn't just someone trying to promote something. They have no connection to it. I trust this person. So a trusted person in your life who clearly has no conflicts of interest related to something, I think that can also be helpful too. Mm-hmm. With something like seed oils and whether seed oils are dangerous or not, I mean, I don't know, man. I cut my teeth on gluten-free diets way back in the day. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you a short story.
Yeah.
I went and did a talk. I was invited to give a talk on these diets. And at the end of the talk, this woman comes up to me. She says, I've been doing a gluten-free diet for my IBS, but I really found your talk interesting. I'm convinced that actually, if I'm honest with myself, it's not really helping that much. It just makes me feel sort of empowered. And I was like, oh, wow, great. I'm glad that talking. She's like, well, so now what do I do for my IBS? And I just kind of sat there. I was like, geez. I walked into this woman's church. I destroyed her rituals that were actually helping her feel empowered. Is what's going to take to change someone's mind about seed oils or gluten? Well, the truth is, I'm not sure I should be in the business of changing someone's mind about it. If someone has gone on a seed oil-free diet and that has caused them to change their dietary patterns and they feel better and they're eating more healthfully and they feel empowered, like what reason would there ever be for them to change their belief about seed oils? It's done nothing but good to them to have this belief. Like, I don't know. I don't know what it would take to convince them. And I'm not really sure that we should be convincing them to change their minds.
Yeah. I'll often say, given that there's always going to be pushback against ideas, a lot of what I'll do in my Substack is I'll just say, do more of what helps you and do less of what hurts you. Interpret that as you will. And be clear on, okay, what is the benefit I'm getting from this? Is this thing harming me? I'm going to try and do less of that. And that just feels pretty solid ground to me to stand on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I'm not a medical professional. This stuff is really tricky, especially because, as you know, in the diet world, someone will do something, or the child rearing world, or whatever. Any of these worlds where we're desperate for answers and we see connections, like the nutritional world. Your stomach hurts, you change your diet, you feel better for 3 days. You're like, oh my God, I finally figured it out. I'm feeling better. I'm never adding that food back in. So now it's working for you, but you're also scared. So what does fear and anxiety do? It creates precisely the same symptoms that gastrointestinal symptoms that you're afraid of in the first place. So you can end up, I think, especially with diet, but also in any area of your life, trapping yourself in a world of correlations that make you feel safe and seem to have worked for you. Again, in the Wired piece, I don't get into this, but I also talked to a lot of severely ill patients who had terrifyingly complicated biomedical protocols. They were taking 5 different prescription medicines. They were taking a slew of supplements. Some of them were on IV supplementation. I would take these. I would send them to experts. I would say, look at this sort of protocol. What do you make of this? And they were like, we have cancer patients, end-stage cancer patients who are not on anything close to this. How did they possibly come up with this protocol? And the answer is, when you're treating these conditions, you end up with protocols that are as Byzantine as the dietary prohibitions that you see over in the diet space. It's no different. And except the only difference is that these protocols are being put together by Lyme literate doctors or by, long COVID literate doctors who are in certain ways doing the same thing what nutrition people are doing. They're looking at the science. They're taking very preliminary studies and considering them to be something that's worth trying. Oh, this looks like this case control trial or this case study seems to say that, IVIG therapy works. Let's put this person on it. So you end up with the same kind of phenomenon, except in the diet world, it's a super restrictive or really bespoke diet. And in the chronic illness world, it's an extremely complicated protocol meant to address all of the different horrible symptoms that people are experiencing.
Which I imagine could have some side effects. Why didn't you put that in the piece? Why did it get edited out?
Well, it's a 7,500 word piece.
Right.
And
there's only so much paper. So much paper in the magazine. People were asking me, why didn't I include the stories of patients who have done these mind-body therapies, been failed by them, and feel they've been harmed by them? I mean, the answer is this is not a piece about all of the failed therapeutic interventions that are out there and the way that people have been harmed by them. I mean, those are both important stories. Yeah. People harmed by mind-body therapies, people on crazy protocols that could have all sorts of health side effects. I mean, for me, this is not about boosting mind-body therapies or boosting biomedical or whatever you want to call it, protocols. That's just a different story. Someone should write it. It's not going to be me. I'll tell you that I'm not writing the hit piece on the unevidenced biomedical protocols that are happening at long COVID clinics. That someone else, if they want to step in there, can do that. I think I'm gonna move on a bit from this topic. Yeah, you might need a break from the Twitter mobs for a little while after this one. Where do you think the longevity movement fits into your work?
I mean, gosh, talk about a movement with a long history. I as I said, my original area of expertise is classical Chinese thought. Mm-hmm. Taoist monks have all kinds of longevity protocols, and those typically involve avoiding whatever it is that the masses are eating, combined with some sort of proprietary supplement regimen, some magic spells, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. I think the longevity movement is just our culture's version of a timeless search, which is the way to get outside of mortality. You have gurus like Brian Johnson. They do the same thing that a lot of these long COVID protocols do. They go to the science, they mine it for stuff that looks promising, but it's actually very preliminary or sketchy. They build it into some kind of protocol. Successful gurus like him also put out the external trappings of what people believe to be health. I mean, this is something I think is really interesting, which is that being shredded is not the same as being extremely healthy.
Right.
Everyone knows that. But you cannot become a guru without being shredded and hairless, basically. I mean, not all of them, but there's this look, right? And that look wouldn't have commanded respect. In 1920, you would have looked like a freak. Right. I mean, people would have been like, what is wrong with this person? They look so scary. So you combine all of these things and you get people to believe that maybe, just maybe, the scariest thing in the world, death, is something that you might not have to face. I would caution, I also do comparative folklore. Mm-hmm. And there's always folk tales about the people seeking to cheat death. And Michael, spoiler alert, there's not a folk tale I've read in which those people succeed. There's not a folk tale I've read in which those people have normal, happy lives. It is ever and always a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Always.
It's this sort of meaningless quest that ends in sort of insanity. Is that what you tend to find in those?
Yeah, insanity, or eventually making some kind of bargain with some sort of malevolent entity.
Deal with the devil.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I don't know, man. I hesitate. One thing I've sort of learned way back from when I was sort of laying into, I don't know if you remember. I mean, maybe I'm old enough to remember the grain brain bestseller, David Perlmutter. There was a not Lustig, I forget the other guy, Wheat Belly. So I remember all these folks. And I ended up looking at David Perlmutter for New York Magazine way back in the day. And I wrote basically a takedown of this guy. He's just not reputable. He's been changing his mind all the time. He's really the sort of embodiment of a guru charlatan. But what I didn't realize is that there's a lot of people that believe in this guy, and he helped them by scaring the crap out of them about gluten. He actually also scared them into just paying attention to their diet. They got better, and sort of trying to take him down is I guess ironically also trying to take down the thing that worked for them. I mean, again, just a short story, but when I was in divinity school, we used to make fun of prosperity gospel guys. There's this guy, Joel Osteen.
Oh, yeah.
He's this just slimiest prosperity gospel guy you can imagine. Huge mega church. He's super rich. He's bringing in all this money. We're all mocking him, blah, blah, blah. One of my friends who was from rural Kentucky was like, yeah, I get it, man. I know you guys are mocking this guy, but you know, my parents were abusive. They didn't pay attention to my education. And in high school, Joel Osteen made me believe that I could go to college.
Wow.
He made me believe that with enough faith, I watched him every day, he said to us. And so I know why you guys are mocking him, and I know he's a slime ball, but like he without him, I wouldn't be here. And that really hit me hard too. You know, they may be gurus and they may be slime balls, but also sadly, they're also helping people. So it's like, I don't know what to do with this stuff. It's very complicated.
How do you square it? Or are you just like, I don't know? It's tricky.
How do I square it? I change my mind in public. I try as much as possible to admit when I'm wrong. I try to hold space for uncertainty and nuance. At the end of the day, I think that the best tools we have to fight against gurus and ultra-processed information is our abilities to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And so as much as I can, that's what I model. I guess that's how I fight against it.
Yeah. Once a person has that lesson, if they find themselves, you know, they've listened to this point and they're going, you know, maybe I have some beliefs that kind of fall into this. What's the move after that? Like, what do you tell people to do?
Be gentle with yourself. Realize that not being dogmatic about something is not the same as not doing it or not holding it lightly. So you don't have to, this is the all or nothing sort of approach. It's like, well, if it's not this, then it must be that. Or if it's not, if there's not good evidence of gluten, like I've changed my mind now, so I just need to change my diet. That it doesn't have to be so extreme. So I would say if people have listened to this point and they're wondering about their own lives, is like, you can loosen your grip on some of the beliefs that you feel like are keeping you alive. Just loosen your grip on them. It doesn't mean changing your life. It doesn't mean believing me. I'm not really saying anything, actually, is the truth. It just means like hold a little bit more lightly. And I think that even in the act of loosening your grip, metaphorically, physically, you relax a little. Yeah. Things don't seem quite so all or nothing. And so just by loosening your grip a little on the beliefs that are important to you, I think you can find that your soul relaxes in the same way that your body relaxes when you loosen your grip a little bit on what you're holding on to.
That's a great message. What have you learned from doing this piece and everything after?
Well, I guess a couple things. One thing is that language is even more important than I thought. And that when it comes to words like mind and body or real and fake that are absolutely foundational parts of how we perceive the world, it's just harder than I thought to overcome the words that we use to describe reality. So that's one thing I've learned. So I need to think harder about how to talk about things in a way that doesn't allow people or myself to fall back into the very categories that I'm trying to transcend. That's one thing I've learned. The other thing I've learned from writing this piece is that I may sound like an idiot. It's like, really, Alan, you didn't know this? But my Lord, the internet and social media is a place that allows people to find groups of other people who are exactly like them and are super upset about the exact same things and agree with them on everything. And it's really unhealthy, I think, intellectually. I said to someone, and I think this is true, the internet is like, it allows you to create a bunch of other people who function like a mirror. And you look at this mirror and you think that what you're looking at is a window onto the world. But a mirror is not a window onto the world. And the internet tricks us into thinking that these screens are windows onto the world when in fact we're just looking at ourselves. And that's tremendously dangerous. In religious terms, that's a form of idolatry. You begin to worship your own image in a way that's deeply problematic, but it's not your fault, because what you're being told is that the screen through which you're getting your information is actually providing you with a view of the world itself. And that's really dangerous as well. So a lot of people are looking into their screens and thinking these are windows, and in fact, they are mirrors.
Mm-hmm. You have a new book that you're working on, right?
Yep.
What's that called? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, so I've learned from people selectively editing clips of interviews like these that I need to work on the subtitle, which, as you know, headlines and book titles are chosen in collaboration with other people, editors and agents.
And when you say collaboration, it means the publisher gives you 3 options and you say, thanks, I don't know if I love any of them. And they go, yeah, but keywords on Amazon or whatever the hell it is.
I'm working on a book called Demons by Another Name.
Okay.
And the subtitle used to be Biology, Belief, and the Stories That Make Us Sick. Okay. And that is a very catchy subtitle, but make us sick makes it sound as if the stories themselves are the cause of the suffering, which is actually not true. Mm-hmm. It can be in some cases, but it is not always. And so I would like to change that to Demons by Another Name, Biology, Belief, and the Stories That Shape Our Suffering. I think that's a better way to think about it. And what that book is going to go into is a variety of different examples of how cultural or personal perspectives on what is causing one's physical and mental suffering end up shaping that suffering through feedback loops. And I call it Demons by Another Name because in other cultural contexts, people have had different names for these forces. They call them demons. They call it witchcraft. They call it, in our culture, we call it stress or loneliness. These are forces that are not physical forces, but have that harm us. And then our belief about what causes our own suffering in relation to these forces and the cultural context we're in shapes our suffering. So if you imagine suffering in certain ways as a kind of, I don't know, like a substance that takes shape in a particular culture. Not all diseases are like this, obviously. Not all illness is like this. But in many cases, the stories that we swim in that are invisible to us sometimes, that are built into our language itself, give shape to our suffering. And so I'm just going to give one example of this.
Please do.
There was a New York Times piece recently, it was super fascinating, about a 20 first responders went to a house in New Mexico where people had called in about an overdose. When they arrived at the house, I think I'm getting the numbers kind of wrong, but 5 people were unconscious, 3 of them were dead. So terrifying situation.
Jeez.
And this was a fentanyl overdose. Mm-hmm. So after that, 20 of the healthcare workers also became sick with symptoms of overdose. And they were rushed to the hospital and they were decontaminated. And the story was reported on. It's really a crazy story. And there was one paragraph where it was like pharmacologists seem to agree that it's very unlikely that you can overdose on fentanyl from contact with it. So one of the theories was that these first responders had gotten it from offering first aid to people. But pharmacologically, there's pretty unanimous agreement that it doesn't work like that. And what turns out is that contact fentanyl poisoning is something that has been around in our culture, especially in law enforcement, since about 2015, when a PSA went out to all police officers about how dangerous fentanyl was and like just touching it could kill you. And so we have lots of law enforcement and healthcare workers who are going out every year. There are stories like this of contact fentanyl overdoses and people saved by Narcan. And there's a real taboo around acknowledging even the possibility that what's happening is that you walk into a house with 3 dead people on the ground and it's stuffy and it smells horrible and it's a terrifying place. And you've heard stories about how fentanyl can kill you if you touch it. Your heart's already racing. You're in there. You're like a first responder and there's 3 dead people. Your nervous system is on red alert. And then now something trips that and there's a cascade effect and you start experiencing physiological symptoms that look a lot like, but not exactly like, as many overdose experts point out, these overdoses, when we have them on camera, and we have some, don't look like overdoses, typical overdoses. They look like panic attacks.
Wow.
But reporting on that, honestly, is almost impossible. And I actually went to Maine to talk with this burly police officer, he had tattoos all over his arms, super nice guy. He was one of the people who had his life saved after a contact fentanyl overdose. And he was like, look, man, I cut my leg with a chainsaw and I drove myself to the hospital. There is no way that what I had was a panic attack. I've been in a million different situations way worse than this. And again, I don't know what happened to him as an individual. What my book is about is not what happened to him. What my book is about is how our current cultural context makes it almost impossible to discuss things like contact fentanyl poisoning because of the implications of a psychogenic or psychological element of what happens to those people. And one of the things I was saying to you before is that even in saying the word psychogenic or psychological, someone's going to clip this and be like, look, Levinovitz thinks that like it's all in our heads, right? This goes back to the Wired article at the very beginning.
Yeah.
It's almost as if I'm going to have to invent new language to discuss these things in a way that doesn't drag us back into the binaries that are making it impossible for us to understand what's really happening.
Why do you think we're so against the idea that things have a psychogenic element?
Forget psychogenic. Let's look at dieting. People who gained a lot of weight or gained a lot of weight and then had difficulty losing it were called lazy. They were told they were slobs. They were told that it was their fault. I mean, Oprah, right? The least lazy woman in the world, right? But like people were blamed for being obese, and they were blamed for not being able to lose their weight. I think that being blamed, feeling like something is your fault, is one of the worst things you can possibly feel. Yeah. So, and it was false. It was false in the case of obesity. It's not true that all of a sudden a bunch of people got lazier right when processed foods hit America. Like, it's just ridiculous, right? It's so, but what happened, and you know this, is that there was this whole there was this whole reaction, understandable but misguided, where they would say things like, well, actually this isn't about how much food you eat. It's not calories in. People would say things like, I eat no more food than anyone else and I'm still really fat. There were all these other theories about what caused weight gain or what stopped people from losing weight. It's your metabolism. It's, I don't know, it's the drugs that you're on. And of course, these are marginally true. Sometimes you can take a drug that causes weight gain, sometimes, often significant weight gain. But at the end of the day, it was always true that weight gain was caused by eating too much and weight could be lost by eating less. And now that we have GLP-1s, of course, the blame element disappears. And so we can go back to sort of observing what was obviously true the whole time, but it couldn't be true without people also being blamed. And so what ended up happening was a defensive reaction against a kind of scientific truth that was oriented towards exculpating people for situations that really weren't their fault, but looked like to the public it was their fault.
Yeah.
So I would say that that's what's going on over in the world of what appears to be suffering that's mediated by beliefs.
That makes sense. Alan, appreciate you coming on. Your book is Natural. Everyone, please read it. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. And I appreciate you doing the Wired piece as well. I thought you did a really nice job with that. And I appreciate you having to be in the trenches afterwards. Someone had to write it.
I'm really grateful to you for those words and for having me on. It's been tough. I not as tough as people who are sick have it, but it was tough. So hearing that sort of thing and having that kind of feedback really means a lot to me. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap. Thanks for checking out the show, and thanks to Alan for coming on to talk about his Wired piece and his book Natural and all his other highly useful ideas. As a reminder, we are in your feed twice a week, so please subscribe so you will get those updates. If you want to watch the show on video, the free iHeart app has all the episodes on video. If you got questions for our Ask Michael Anything section, drop them in the comments or send them to media@twopct.com. We'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can. And in closing, as we always do, as we always will, have fun, don't die.